Welcome everyone to fall semester 2026 and to this class. Uh, this part makes me feel a little bit like I'm a airline attendant, letting you know where the flight is going to make sure you're on the right flight. So hopefully you're in the right place. This is Colonial Latin America History 3100. My name's Jessica Delgado, and I teach in the history department as well as in women's gender and sexuality studies. My goal for this video is to be short. I want to tell you just a little bit about me and how I come to be your teacher this semester, and a little bit about what the class is about in terms of content and approach, and just a tiny bit at the end about course materials, and a couple things that I want you to be prepared for next week. And then I will release you to read the course introduction material, and I'll say a little bit more about what that is and why it's important, acknowledging that it is a lot to read on this first day, but let you know why I think it'll be worth it. So I'm doing this obviously because we're not seeing each other today. We will see each other Thursday. Attendance is very important on Thursday because we're going to get started organizing things that are going to matter for the rest of the semester. So please do your best to come. I've learned over the years that it is for at least this kind of a class, that's kind of a survey-ish course where there's a lot of things to cover in the beginning, that it makes more sense to give you a little bit of a break, give you one class that you don't have to come to physically, and give you a chance to read this material and process it, and then do the review exercise that I've asked you to do to let me know right away what doesn't make sense. The way I teach is a little different from what you may be used to. Again, I'll say more about that in a little bit. But for all of those reasons, and also because people's schedules tend to be in flux at first, I think it makes more sense to have the first class be asynchronous. Uh, but that means that you kind of don't have a face to the name unless I do a little intro video. So that's the justification for all of this. Not because I love videos. I'm not really all that great at them, even though you will be watching a fair number of them this semester. Again, I'll say more about that later. So, me, then the class. I was uh, uh, I started out as an undergraduate at UC Santa Cruz in the California UC system as a well, at that point it was a women's studies major focusing on religion. And through actually an exploration of particular aspects of women's involvement in social justice movements in Latin America and the significance of religion to those social justice movements, I ended up becoming interested in history and in the history of Latin America. Half of my family is from Cuba. I thought maybe I would study Cuba. I ended up not studying Cuba. I ended up studying Mexico, which also made sense because, in terms of personal connections, having grown up in California, but also my Cuban family actually settled in El Paso, Texas, and my aunts became a part of Mexican American families through marriage, et cetera. And so I had a lot of connections to Mexico as well, and that's where I ended up doing my research when eventually I completed a PhD. After I left the undergraduate, however, I didn't go straight to graduate school. I did a whole lot of other things. And then I came back to graduate school for a while at UC Santa Cruz, and then I started all over for various reasons at UC Berkeley. And UC Berkeley is where I got my PhD, and it's a very traditional kind of history department. Um, so I learned a very kind of disciplinary, disciplinarily um, not rigid, but invested, let's say, way of approaching history in the big picture. But my advisor, William Taylor, was a very interdisciplinary minded historian and was very interested in religious studies and in anthropology, and in other sorts of things. So I did have a kind of broad training. And the way that I think about history, and I'll say a little more about this in the first couple days of class, and the way that I think about how we relate to the past and the challenges of working with the fragments is really shaped by that formative work that I did with him. But I have evolved since then. I've been teaching for a really long time to develop some of my own ideas that also shape the way that I approach this history. And I will try to make those things clear in the beginning because you do not have to share those approaches to history. But I think it's important to let you know where I'm coming from so that you can be critical, so that you can think critically, so that you can identify the kind of historian that I am. And I want to help you think about the kind of historians that you are reading and to help you become your own historians through intimate work with primary sources yourself. Um, I like to think of myself when I'm teaching as more of a tour guide, um, a, perhaps a highly trained tour guide, but a tour guide nonetheless, in which I am trying to take into account your interests, but I have prepared something for you. I invite you to trust me to come along on this journey, but I want your feedback as we go. And I most importantly want to help you right from the beginning think about really what you are committed to doing and to getting out of this class through your own active engagement. So, again, more on that later. I taught at Princeton for the first 10 years, actually in the religious studies department as a historian I taught for a couple of years at Smith College, but then my first real permanent tenure track job was at Princeton. I did get tenure at Princeton. And that 10 years of working as a historian at Princeton, but in the religious studies department, also really shaped my approach to both teaching and scholarship. I came to OSU for family reasons and have been very happy to be here. I got here in the infamous spring semester of 2020, which was a strange time to begin. And in some ways, because of that, I think I still feel a bit like a newcomer and I'm getting to know things. And as you know, any of you who've been here for more than, unless this is your first semester, you know that things have been rapidly changing institutionally in the last couple of years. And there are implications for that that we will talk about also when we talk about the course material. Uh, my favorite thing about teaching at OSU really genuinely has been the undergraduate community, the undergraduate individuals that I have met and had in classes. I love how different each of my classes are. Partly that's because of the way that I teach in a way that is somewhat spontaneous and allows for collaboration. But because of that, every class is different because every group of students is different. And I learn a tremendous amount from you all. And I have just really enjoyed, students are different everywhere. And I always like my students, but honestly, OSU undergraduates have been my favorite of anywhere that I've taught. Um, so don't ruin that. uh, I just realized that sounded like a lot of pressure. So I'm teasing. That's me. So that's who I am, a little bit of who I am and some of the influences that I bring with me. We will talk probably those more things will come out as I talk concretely about ways that I approach being a historian. But now I just want to say a little bit about this class. So this is a survey class in colonial Latin America. It is taught that way because it is part of the standard curriculum, and we don't have the ability to teach a whole lot of classes outside of the United States and Europe. And so we feel a responsibility, we meaning generations of faculty and people who create curriculum here at OSU and almost everywhere, to at least introduce two survey courses to you in the gigantic area that is Latin America colonial Latin America. We divide it up into that time period, which is officially 1492 to 1820-ish. 1820 is when mainland independence happened, but the Caribbean and Brazil took longer for independence to happen. So, really, the colonial period, if we were focusing on them, which we won't be in a primary way, should go longer. But that's the standard chronology. That's what we do. And I want to say that that's a ridiculous thing to do. It makes no sense to teach a survey course about 300 years in such a vast area, which at the beginning of this era consisted of hundreds of different um, cultural groups, language groups, organized into small states, small communities, as well as large states, as well as empires. And in regions, so a couple of them within the imperial structure of big empires, but most of them organized in small states. And even those organized in the imperial empires, the actual places where people lived and produced goods and had different kinds of agricultural practices, etc., were so distinct geographically and quite difficult to travel in between that we have a very diverse, there's patterns that we can talk about overall, but really we have an enormously diverse area in terms of lifeways, in terms of economic practices, geography, etc., all kinds of things. So we have that at the beginning, something very diverse and complicated, really should be taught in at least, separate regions. And then we've got 300 years of colonial experience, which is experienced quite differently in these different regions that end up in a process that ultimately will produce many, many countries, as you know, in Latin America. So we have a survey course for the United States and we have a survey course for Latin America, basically a continent of experience and 300 years. So that's impossible. It's impossible to effectively teach that history unless you are zooming out to such a big picture that you are oversimplifying, that you're telling overarching stories. And when we tell overarching stories, what are the things that we hang, the pieces on? What are the big patterns that we name? Traditionally, we have focused on political, military, and economic history because it seems like we can see some big patterns. But even there, in terms of how it affects different groups of people or how these big patterns show up locally, there is still a lot of diversity. So, in order to do the impossible, how I approach it is I present multiple ways into this story, multiple ways into this vast narrative. And one of those ways is to provide primarily outside of class through synthetic overview texts that are really good. I gotta say, I haven't chosen boring textbooks, but one that's a kind of cutting edge one that you'll be reading by edited by or written by Matthew Restall and Chris Lane. Um, and also some other chapters from another textbook that is called Forgotten Places and People that really try to introduce you to some of those patterns through the margins and through examples of perhaps you might want to say the exceptions to the overarching pattern, but really maybe it's not the exceptions. It's just like the title of the book says, places and people that have been overlooked when making that big synthetic history. So through those synthetic overview and also through my own pre-recorded lectures, in which I give kind of traditional lectures. I give lectures that will not repeat the textbooks because it's my own way into it, but it will be a lot of information talking about big changes, talking about cultural qualities and talking about themes and things that I hope are interesting, but told in such a way that is, that kind of fairly zoomed out um, big picture. There will be, in some instances, a lot of particular examples, but even those examples will try to tie into that big picture. So those lectures are best listened to outside of class. Even though I know that's not everybody's favorite way to do it, it is also not everybody's favorite way to sit in a class and to just be lectured at. So I invite you to relate to my lectures not as something that you need to, sorry, my computer's telling me something, um, memorize or write a bunch of notes on. I have also provided lecture notes that in some cases are quite close to the lectures. In some cases, they are more like outlines, but I've provided them for you also so that you, if you would like, you can print them out, you can read them, you can look at them, you can use them as reference, you can use them to take notes if you like. But I personally encourage you to simply turn my lectures on and treat them like podcasts. So, if you can put them on in your headphones while you're taking a walk, if you can do them while you're folding laundry or whatever, uh, allow yourself to just hear the big picture. Take note if you want to, and if you can, to the questions that come up, the things that are particularly interesting for you, because then in class, I will be building on those overviews. I will be asking you all questions, asking you all what you were interested in, and we'll have a much more interactive experience in class in which we will talk about primary sources, we'll talk about the readings, and I will present new information, but it will build on and add nuance to, hopefully, in conversation with you, that material. So do your best. I know you won't be able to consume all of it. In some weeks, I actually tell you to choose, a couple of lectures from a much larger list because there's a lot that's available to you. And I know you won't be able to have time to listen to all of them, but if you're interested, I want you to be able to pick the ones that seem most interesting to you. And they're all for you to keep, so you can go back and listen to them another time if you're interested, even beyond the class. So that's to talk about the survey course structure. Those are the kind of overview ways. In class, I already described what we're going to be doing, but the other really important backbone of the class is your work with primary sources. So you will be reading primary sources. Um, Sometimes there'll be a lot of primary sources to choose from. Other times we will be reading just a small amount of primary sources so that we can really focus on them and talk about them. You'll talk about them with each other. We will talk about them in the meeting where we meet all together as a large group. And then also you will be choosing from a very long list of secondary sources of historical studies that are very good, all of them, but from historians that have a wide range of expertise geographically, thematically, and lots of different kinds of approaches. And the goal here is for you to choose, and this will happen towards the end of the semester or the second half, to choose a study that represents something that you have become interested in, and to have more of a a deeper experience with something in particular that is not a survey approach, that is a um, more in-depth, more specific kind of approach. And finally, you will be choosing between two historical fiction novels that I hope you really enjoy that will give you also a different kind of sense of the past. So we will talk a lot more about all of that material as it goes. The main thing you'll be doing outside of class is reading and watching videos, and you will be working on a collaborative project that's a semester-long collaborative project that you will come up with together with your working group. I know nobody likes group work. This is not group work. You will read about what I mean by that, but trust me, I don't like group work either. I approach the working groups as intellectual communities through a concept called true collaboration that comes out of something called the Impossible Project that I'm a part of. I'm not going to spend time talking about that right now. I have a whole audio recording about what true collaboration is, and we will talk more about it, and you can read more about it. But what I just want to say now, right off the bat, is that I really think probably like 97% of the people that I've taught using this method end up loving the working groups, having that be their favorite part of the class, and finding it a really exceptional experience because we approach it very differently than most group work is approached in the context of traditionally graded um, classes. And you will understand more what I mean later when you read and listen to the rest of the stuff. Um, but so now that's how I'm thinking about getting into the material. So I interrupted myself. So outside of class, those things. Inside of class is where you will be doing the bulk of your work, of the work that you produce, if you want to think about it that way. You will be keeping a course journal, and that is also outside of class, but also inside of class. So please purchase or obtain in some way a notebook and bring it to class every day. You will be doing a free association primarily 10 minutes a day from Monday through Friday. I don't care how long it is. The actual content is not really very important, although I have requested a few things about guidelines about how you might approach it. But really, it's about building associative memory that will last. Um, uh, Working against fragmented learning in which you have, this amount of time for this class, this amount of time for this class, which is very efficient for getting things done, but it's not really the way that we learn. We learn in ways that sort of plug things into our whole experience, into whatever else is going on in our lives. And so this is an exercise that helps you do that. And it will also help you prepare for what we're doing in class. So, handwritten journal is one of the big things that you'll be doing outside of class and inside of class. We'll have writing exercises that do that. And then, other than that, it's really a lot of exercises and activities that I hope will be fun and create a sense of curiosity and accountability. There will be a final exam on final exam week, but it is not a traditional final exam. You're not going to have to memorize things. You will actually create your own final exam question in collaboration with me. There'll be a process of proposing it. And the way that you will propose that question is I'm basically asking you to design a question that represents a way of sharing and synthesizing what you have already learned. So I'm not approaching the final exam as a way of making sure that you learned specific things or even asking you to review and learn specific things, which is the way that I have done it in the past, which is the traditional way that people have done it. I changed the way that I taught pretty dramatically about 7 or 8 years ago. And now this final exam is actually an opportunity for you to pull together what you have already learned and to do something different with it in a way that will be meaningful for you, that both communicates to me what you've learned, but primarily for you to to synthesize it and then do something with it, and then go a little bit beyond for yourself. We will talk more about this, but I promise you, this is not this isn't um, a scary assignment. Okay. Um, it's very hard not to get into those things because I can feel your worry. So let me just say quickly that the way that I teach is committed to creating an environment of co-learning. There is a lot of reading and a lot of work to do, but I understand that you will not be able to do it all. And the class and the process of the system of self-evaluation and collective evaluation and me evaluating your work is based on um, a system of ungrading and a system of contract grading that you'll learn more about. And it is designed to focus on process over product, designed to get you to track and to evaluate your work based on the criteria of effort, commitment, curiosity, and collaboration. It's a system that is called ECCC, ungrading system, and there's specific definitions of those words that you will learn about when you read the material. And that system is a system of tracking and keeping yourself honest and aware of how much you are remaining aligned with your own commitments, your own learning commitments, as well as helping you cultivate actively a practice of curiosity, which is a practice of extended inquiry, even when you find something boring. It's not really just feeling curious. And then true collaboration, which we will talk more about. But effort and commitment is meant to help you think about just how much time and energy you're putting into this work, and then how much of that time and energy is actually going towards what you want to learn, what you find important. So that tracking system does not translate directly into grades. We will do a method of contract grading in order to arrive at final grades. I am personally quite against grading. If I could not give you grades, I would. I was trained in a system outside of grades initially before I went to UC Berkeley. I was an undergraduate in a system that did narrative evaluations, and then I taught for several years in that same place as a graduate student, but really doing a lot of teaching. And then I was there when they transitioned to grades, and I watched the change, and I feel very confident that it is a destructive change in terms of the grades are destructive in terms of encouraging people to actually learn and be motivated by their own interests, and be willing to stretch and try hard things and experiment and do things that they aren't already good at, without fear of failure, because failure has weight when you're in a grade system. Whereas if you are outside of that system, experimenting and trying hard things, you do because you want to. You do because you genuinely want to stretch. And I strive in a lot of complicated but hopefully understandable ways to have created a system that does as as best a job as we can within a structure that ultimately gives you fi final grades, letter grades, to create that kind of an environment in which that is really the motivation. So it's different than the way a lot of people teach. There are minimal requirements for passing the class. This is something that I have only recently introduced, and have done so because over the years of teaching with this ECCC method and contract grading, those students find it really freeing and liberating. And once they understand it, the feedback I've gotten is really good. There's also been a lot of feedback about just anxiety, at least until the end. Nobody's anxious afterwards because they trust me and they see that I really mean what I say about what I value and that this is a collaborative process. But understandably, if you aren't quite sure if you're even going to pass the class, because all of this seems kind of loosey-goosey, then it can create anxiety. So right from the bat, there are some minimal um, requirements in order just to pass the class, and I think you'll find them very reasonable. And then beyond that, I'm going to try my best to get you to forget about grades and to think about evaluating your work and engaging with your work in this process-oriented way. But you will also early on be in communication with me about the plan to get the grade that you want through contract grading. But those things, we try to keep them separate. So I just said a lot more about that than I wanted to. In this thing, but I think it's important when trying to talk about all of the, or I decided just now that it was important when trying to talk about all the work that you're going to be doing in this class. So now the last thing that I'm going to say, I've reversed the order of what I said I would do in the beginning, is to say just a little bit about actually what this class is about then. So I just said it was a survey class about colonial Latin America, about this giant geographical region and this large time period. But how, in general, am I approaching this history, this story? It's through the way that what I can offer you as an overall arching narrative is that there's nothing natural about the term Latin America. It was never a foregone conclusion that this giant place would end up being a, anything unified, an identifiable unit, political unit, cultural unit, etc. It became what we now think of as Latin America through a process of colonial exploration, invasion, um, rule, and the dramatic transformations and creative inventions and changes that linked this part of the world with the rest of the world in the what we call the early modern era. So the story will be to look in the beginning as best we can at a subject that really should take an entire semester as well, at least, which is to look at the world of this part of the Americas before Europeans arrived, and also to look at the Iberian Peninsula before the people that were not at the time called Spaniards, did not think of themselves as Spaniards. They also represented a lot of different kingdoms, different languages, etc. But the process of this part of the world understanding itself and creating itself as something that could be called Spaniards eventually, in the context of and actually through their interactions with this giant world of human beings who spoke different languages and thought of themselves really differently. So the story of this semester is the story of becoming Latin America, a region and a bunch of people who were not from that region together becoming Latin America. Now, the word becoming sounds kind of soft, and this is not a soft process. Especially in the beginning, what we're going to see is a story of destruction of tragic proportions, destruction, um, uh, tragedy, um, confusion, all kinds of things that we will be looking at all too briefly. But it is also a story of not just resilience and resistance on the part of indigenous people and people from Africa, but also a story of dramatic and very interesting transformations and creativity that come from the people who are living these things. And and that's the kind of becoming that we're going to be looking at as people start to understand themselves as having a specific experience that is shaped by what will eventually come to be understood as Spanish and Portuguese, better said Iberian, I think, colonial expansion and rule, but also understanding themselves as as having their own kind of history that is really distinct from both Europe and also from the histories that they have inherited. But this is a long process. It never destroys local identities, neither in Iberian Peninsula nor in the Americas, nor among the people who are descendants from the people in Iberia and also the people from Africa. In languages, cultural identities, geographically distinct experiences will continue far more than the overview synthetic story allows us to see, at least until the 19th century. In a great many ways, they have continued all the way until today. But at least until the 19th century, indigenous people remained the vast majority of the population in spite of the massive um, uh, impact of mass death that came from the epidemics in the early years. Still, they were greater of a portion of the population, far greater than people of European descent. And people still understood themselves to be first and foremost members of a nation and a community and a language group that was distinct from other people who lived in other parts of Latin America. And the people we call Spaniards still also considered themselves, even if they had been there for generations, they still did understand themselves to be perhaps in some ways less because there was less of them, but uh, related to distinct places in the Iberian Peninsula. So we'll learn more about that in the first few weeks of class. Um, but there is a process by which, in terms of legal categories, in terms of rights and responsibilities, and not really rights, obligations and responsibilities, and really different kinds of local structures in relationship to the law, in relationship to cultural practices, etc., uh, that have specifically to do with interactions with the colonial state. All of these people who understand themselves first and foremost to be Mixtec or, you know, um, or Mayan or places. And I'm getting hung up a little bit because in some ways people started to identify with language groups. In some ways, people started to name themselves in relationship to geography, but they continued to think of themselves as first and foremost um, part of what was formerly a nation. Now, perhaps people might think of as ethnic groups, but that's who they were. They were not Indians, right, is what I'm trying to say. But all of these people in the process of becoming Latin America, did grow to understand that in terms of the colonial state, they were Indians. They were legally a category that implied a particular kind of set of obligations and responsibilities, and also um, responsibilities owed to them and position within the colonial state. And this was a very hierarchical society in which these different categories of people supposedly had different legal rights and responsibilities. And so the process of becoming colonial Latin America started to layer on collective identities that had to do with a collective and broad and general pattern of experiences unified by colonial rule. So that process is real. That process is a part of everybody's experience. But the ways that people experienced it locally is what gets lost when we look at this big picture. And so focusing on the becoming Latin America hopefully will allow us to keep both the global and the local in mind. The global is very important because part of what happens in this process of becoming Latin America is that indigenous people, for instance, who live in this part of the world, become absolutely important and active participants in a global economy, in a global cultural exchange that affects Europe as much as it affects, well, in many ways, affects Europe as profoundly, perhaps not as personally, but as profoundly as it shapes the world of the Americas. So that's the overall kind of conceit that I'm using to approach how we're going to hang all of these stories together. And so I invite you to think about that. Also, to think about other ways that we might, as you learn more, other ways that we might describe this whole overarching process. Within that, the story of becoming Latin America, we will be focusing on things like the role of religion and understanding how religion is not the way we think of religion, meaning that when I say religion, I'm not just talking about belief systems or institutional religious structures. I'm talking about uh, something that is part and parcel, intimately involved, not at all separate from political processes, from economic processes, from scientific understandings. So we're going to be thinking about and learning about the way that what we now call religion operated really differently at this time and how important it was to this process of becoming. We're going to be thinking about and looking at the very different way that authority worked, especially between the 17th and the 18th century. We'll be looking at change over time and thinking about some of these big processes that have to do with a changing sense of self and relationship. Oh my gosh, it's doing a weird bubble thing. That's so weird. I presume you can see that too. Um, uh, Different ways that authority worked, different ways that the self in relationship to community worked, different understandings of how society ought to be structured. So, in terms of what you might call judicial power versus executive power, we'll be focusing on a whole lot of things like that. I think I'm going to stop there because I am starting to ramble and it is already very long. My mind is starting to think about all of the the lectures and thematic explorations that I want to be saving for the first few weeks. So if you've gotten through this, thank you. I will see you on Thursday. I am excited. Please take time to read through the material and at least do that before you come on Thursday. Do your best to do those three first day assignments and then take a deep breath. And I promise you that the rest of the semester will be less about structure and more about learning about people's lives and experiences in the past. All right. Thank you and see you Thursday.